Hey folks, Steve here with another End of Empire video for you today. We're going to be looking at King George's War, 1744 to 1748, which is a base game scenario. And we're kind of at the point now where it's going to be less and less likely I'm going to be doing anything from post-publication scenarios or even paper wars at this point, though I might take a look at some of the variant stuff, and we may get some of that on camera. Um, but this is definitely going to be an interesting one because it's where, at least up till now in the video series of the different scenarios that we've played through chronologically, this is the first one where a lot of the base game rules really have full effect. For all the other ones that we've played, there were certain things that, just because of the size of the scenario or representing a less cultivated North America in terms of like European settlements, we just operated on different rule sets or special rules. But now those are largely going away. So what is on the map is what's on the map, except for one little exception that I'll mention here in a minute. And we're also going to start dealing with a lot more units on the map at any given time. So from here, King George's War is decent sized. Then the next one would be French and Indian War, and that is a bit heavier than this. And then finally, there's the American Revolution, which is a lot of counters, just a whole bunch. So this is sort of easing into it a little bit, and I would generally say that this scenario is smaller than the French and Indian War, but it's still, still has plenty here to look at. Unfortunately, this scenario doesn't have a big, long introduction with it written into the scenario book or anything. This is a North American theater for the War of the Austrian Succession, which has, oh gosh, a whole bunch of stuff tied to it. There's a game by Compass called A Pragmatic War, which covers the European conflict. It's a card-driven game. It's fun, using the no peace without Spain system. Um, and I think in many ways this particular war, King George's War, is definitely a precursor. It's the third wilderness war, so to speak, or the French and Indian Wars. If you really look at it, as there were multiple, this would be the third one. The fourth being the one we usually refer to as the French and Indian War. So what's the dealio with this one? Well, we're going to start on turn one, which is a spring turn, and we're going to play until turn 27, or rather, turn 27 is the last turn, which makes it a summer turn of 1748. So we'll have, basically a little over, I guess we'll have like 4.5 campaign seasons. We are going to be using the North map only, so things like winter impacting activation ratings will matter. And obviously, supply always matters, but in particular here, we'll have to watch out for that. Now, what's really interesting with this scenario is that we're going to have eventually a case where the French and the British fleets can both be possibly at play, dramatically changing, the naval amphibious type of operations and what's able to be achieved. There's also now a lot greater emphasis on different types of units that are going to be available to each side and how they operate. So just kind of browse around the map here for a second. The French have these standard units that we're used to seeing, these mixed units that have both linear factors and ambush factors, some of them with the plus, meaning they can attack an ambush, that are in Fort Niagara, in Fort Frontenac, in, let's see, what do they want to refer to this as? Fort St. Frederick, Crown Point, rather, I guess, is what we would probably refer to it as. So the French hold that. They've got a unit in Montreal. They got a unit in Three Rivers. They've got a unit in Quebec City. Not all of them have fortifications. at start, but several of them do. When we look at Nova Scotia, the British do hold Annapolis. They have a British regular regiment in there under a fort marker. The Micmac Native American allies are activated out here for the French. They have a regiment, which is just a infantry regiment. It does not have ambush capability, which makes it a little dangerous. And then we've got a couple of units situated in Louisbourg, which finally exists on the map. And I just want to show there's this fairly strong special British infantry, not British, my gosh, French infantry, which I think somewhere this unit in particular represents, I don't know if it's Swedes or somebody. I'd have to go look that up. But it's a special unit. Doesn't have much gameplay impact, but there you go. And then basically everything else on the map is as the map displays it, except for Halifax, which still does not exist. So there is a bit of errata that is not in the scenario book by default that says treat Halifax as a wilderness port, not a supply source. And so I am using one of my green bingo chits. This is the last green bingo chit we will use to reflect these sorts of things. So Halifax is not the supply anchor for the British. That is Boston, like many of the other older, other scenarios that occurred previous in time. And then in terms of the actual continental, not continental, I guess, but main colony British units, there's just good old Governor Shirley, governor of the American colonies in Boston by himself with no units, just this leader who is not going to add much to combat, and he activates 50% of the time on non-winter turns. So you might say, well, what's the deal, Steve? The French at least have some units on the board. What can the British do with just good old Shirley on the table? Well, for the first time in, well, maybe not the first time, because I think there have been some scenarios where there have been militia, but they were used in much smaller numbers, and I didn't go into much detail on these guys. There are a whole bunch of these state militia, colonial militia, I guess I should refer to them, given that they're not states yet. We have them for New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, which is over here, New Hampshire, and then one for Maine. So really, there's not no units in the colonies up here, but they are technically militia, and you can read the rule book on this. I don't want to just repeat everything in the rule book, but just as a heads up, what it basically means is if the French were to come down here and they entered one of these hexes, we could intercept and call up or react move the Vermont militia into whatever space that the French entered and force a combat. And in this case, the Vermont militia actually has a +1 ambush factor, which is kind of interesting. I like that. In fact, a couple of these units do. The New Hampshire has a +2. That's interesting. Now, each of these militia units are different strength. There's 5 for New Jersey, 11 for New York, 23 for Connecticut, only 5 for Rhode Island, 25 for Massachusetts. That's pretty consistent with other scenarios. 2 linear for Vermont, 10 linear for New Hampshire, and 2 for Maine. So not all of these militia are created equal. They are distinct units. The British can call them up and just say that, like, hey, these guys I'm going to call up and they're just going to exist where I place them. So if we wanted to, we could certainly do that, just to kind of make it seem like we're strong. We've got some guys out there. What do we want to do with them? Set something up like that. The only thing is, when you take a step loss in combat, the militias all go home. They all leave the map. You can replace them, later on a separate turn, but technically they are considered withdrawn at that. So again, just to summarize, you can bring them onto the map and say that they're there, or you can keep them in an available box, or I'm just throwing them in the sea right now for ease, and say, well, we're going to interrupt French movement and throw that guy in there, have a fight. Because the militia will always kind of replace themselves over time, what this reflects in the game is like, yeah, we have some mobilized militia, some high enough population to support some level of armed men to protect the colonies if the French were to invade and cause some trouble down here. So they could take a step, they could win a fight, they could get a 1-1 result and hurt the French and then disappear. But it's not like the British have really lost anything because they'll get that militia unit back eventually. This is similar to the provincial units. The main thing with these militia is that they are withdrawn at the spring withdrawal phase of every year and the fall withdrawal phase of every year, and that's to represent that these are just normal blokes. They're going to go plant their crops. They're going to go collect their crops. Whereas the provincial units, which have an E enlistment letter in their withdraw uh, part of their counter, represent enlisted men that are intended to stick around. And so they'll usually come up in the spring and they'll operate the whole way through the year until winter, and then they'll go home. And those units tend to be replaceable pretty much every year as well. So the British are going to have, in terms of the asymmetry of this scenario and the French and Indian War scenario, so this kind of applies to both, the British are going to be leaning on basically replenishable units that have limited operating capabilities. They can only go so far before they have to go back home. So there's an extent, they can only ever go as far as multiple turns that they'll be available for, allow them to get. So militia, are never going to move really more than a couple turns away from their starting space. A provincial enlisted unit is only going to be able to go, basically 5 turns worth of movement if they activate it every single turn before they have to go home. So that definitely limits their flexibility. And then the British will then lean on, knowing those limitations, leaning on British regulars, which will not withdraw and will have more permanency on the map. Now, by comparison, the French will be operating much like they've done in other scenarios where they've got some of these mixed force units, some of which have ambush factors, but they also have an ability to get replacements. So in some of the other scenarios, we've had some replacement rules where they get like 1 step in Montreal, 1 step in Quebec or something to rebuild, some of these guys, these basic troop units. Some of them are better than others. But now we're going to be dealing with something a little bit different. So basically, this is the standard rule for this scenario in the French and Indian War, where as long as you're controlling Montreal and Quebec, you can get some provincial troop replacements. And basically, that category is the French units with the white, you can kind of see it, the pale, white counter, but pale blue stripe running left to right. That's a provincial unit. And if you wanted to replace a regular, this is the example of a regular, just a pure white unit with a blue icon, blue verbiage. If you wanted to replace that, what you can do is you can draft a step from a provincial to replace that. So just as an example, if these 2 units were nearby each other during the replacements phase, we could say, hey, I'm going to draft this unit into this regular. So we're going to eliminate that step, and then we're going to replenish this up to its max step. It's a little interesting system. It's something special that the French can do that the British can't, which is they're essentially taking colonial provincials, and they're turning them into regulars. So as long as you can, you choose to do that, you can replenish your regulars as the French, though, these regulars are typically not going to have ambush factors where some of your provincials will. So you're sort of having an opportunity cost there. Generally speaking, the British in any of the scenarios to come are not going to be able to get replacements for their regulars. You can shift steps around as the British regulars, as the British with your regulars, but they're not going to be able to promote provincials into regulars, except for a couple of very specific examples that even the ones that I'm referencing right now, I wouldn't even consider them regular units in a pure sense. But we'll talk about that here in another minute. Boy, this is a long intro, guys. I'm sorry, but this is where the game really starts to become, at least the scenarios we're playing through really becomes the game itself, or like we're playing the game as it was originally designed in the game box, not with post-publication expansion stuff. Anyway, so this war is going to start with the British basically relying on their militia, but over time they're going to gain more reinforcements. They're going to start getting some rangers. So on turn 2, we'll actually get this ranger unit. What's that? Gorham's Rangers. So very similar to Church from some of our earlier scenarios. Then on turn 8, there's going to be a whole bunch of reinforcements that come on. And these are going to be provincial enlisted men who are being drawn up to fight the war. Then over time, the French are going to get some reinforcements, which are really more provincials. And then there's a few other scattered reinforcements. One of the very special things that occurs with this scenario will be regarding the capture of Louisburg. So, Louisburg was an important thing. It exists now. It limits the ability of the British to put their fleet in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The British will want to take Louisburg like they did in the historical war here. But there are some special things that are tied up in that. So after the fall of Louisburg, if they can achieve it, the British will get a certain number of additional regular reinforcements with artillery. So that's always a nice bonus. And then also, and this is something that's not super clear in the rules, but it's my interpretation of it, you can then replace 2 enlisted units in Louisburg that happen to be in Louisburg into these units. And the main thing I would say about this is that they are artillery-enabled units, and they have no withdrawal factor. Even if their combat factors may be even less than enlisted units in some cases, if they're in Louisburg, you can opt to sort of upgrade them into these stable units that will not withdraw. And again, that can be a good advantage over time. Then in response to that, the French also get some special reinforcements if Louisburg falls, sort of a reinforcement to save the day. But ooh, they carry something a little concerning. So the reinforcements include some of these French regulars that I mentioned you could replenish with promotions, and a leader. And he's a pretty good leader too. He actually gives you a +1 to your die roll, or a bonus to combat, and he's a 4 campaign rating, which is pretty great. But he brings with him typhus. So there's a typhus marker. There's a marker for typhus. And the way that'll work is, if these guys come into the board, any units in a hex with the typhus marker must remain in that hex. They cannot move while the typhus marker is on the map. And then during the end of each turn, all units of both sides in the hex with the typhus marker suffer attrition. And then after that, you got to roll for your leaders to see if the leaders die of typhus. And then there's a die roll to see if the epidemic continues. So it's one of these really tough things. This is historically what happened. These French reinforcements arrived, but they had typhus. And, the French could potentially weaponize that typhus if they can get into a hex with some British or something and create a really nasty disease situation. I'm not sure how that's going to work when we get to that point, if we get to that point. But something to think about. In terms of the naval infantry, when the fleets arrive, the British and the French fleets, we will be using, see if I can grab the player aid sheet. There is a specific fleet availability chart, which tells us for King George's War the availability die roll needed for each. So the British can start coming in on turns 7 through 10, and then a bunch of other turns. You got to be really careful about which turns are which. And the French can come in only starting on turn 13 on die rolls of 2 or less. So we start to actually use this fleet availability chart on the actual game charts. And they will each have naval infantry, so we can do some interesting, naval marine supported combats. The other thing I should note is that Indian recruitment is done per the normal rules that are shared with the French and Indian War. So there is a dedicated, we got the available allies up there. But there is a whole system that governs Indian recruitment where previous scenarios we were basically just looking to roll a 1 on a d6. Here it's much more involved. So there is there's basically a set of charts for the American Revolution. There's a set of charts for King George's War and the French and Indian War. And it's basically what you do each turn is you're going to look at conditions to see if they apply. For Iroquois, the more regions that are special, which you can see up here in the upper right or the top of this section, if the British hold certain territories, they're going to get a certain number of points, and then that's going to govern when or if those units are going to stay on the board, if they're going to withdraw, or maybe if they're going to be doing stuff with the French. You can see some of that. Some of them require control of locations like Montreal or Fort Pitt, Fort Duquesne. And then for the French allied Indians, there's a little bit of errata here that I've marked in pen. But basically, some similar logic. So it's a little bit more involved. So every turn, we've got to mess around with that. And it could be a little time consuming just to check all those cases, but assuming the cases don't change turn to turn, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what you need to roll. What could happen, I think, for like the British in many cases could be that if the French take control of certain locations from the British or vice versa, you could see those allied units disappear before the start of a turn when you were really counting on them being able to help you out in some attack that you've been preparing for, you've been working to achieve. Okay, so I kind of covered all of that. I think we covered all the big stuff. The final thing I want to throw out there. I know, 20 minutes, guys. It's taken me more time to talk through this than to play it some of the time. The victory conditions for this scenario. So, the British player will win an immediate decisive victory if he controls Annapolis, Louisbourg, in Quebec. So that's sort of your clean sweep of all the big important locations on the map. They start with Annapolis. They want to take Louisbourg, which is what part of what they did historically, and then they want to take Quebec, right? The French player wins an immediate decisive victory if he controls Annapolis, so taking it from the British. Louisbourg, which means they retain control of Louisbourg, and they take Boston down here, which I'm not sure how likely that is, but that's perfectly feasible. And then if neither of those conditions are achieved by the end of turn 27, the player who controls the majority of the following hexes will win: Annapolis, Louisbourg, and Crown Point. So interestingly, if you're not able to get a full knockout blow on your opponent, all of a sudden this fort in the middle of the wilderness then becomes important. And I could certainly see a situation where, if what it really requires is that the French don't lose Louisbourg. So Louisbourg's super important in this scenario, as it probably should be. And if the French can hold on to that, can reasonably hold on to Crown Point, they can come out with a victory. The British, I think, given enough time, the British can probably take Louisbourg. And then whether or not they can take Crown Point, I'm not so sure, but I feel reasonably confident they could probably keep a hold of Annapolis. But we'll see how it all plays out. So, yeah, I think so. What I'm going to do from here, guys, is I'm going to play a year and we'll see where we get. Again, there's not going to be much that really happens in the first year other than the British are going to get their rangers and they're going to be able to start kind of scoping out what they want to do with the ranger unit. Unfortunately, that ranger unit is not an automatic activation leader unit, so it might be really slow for a while until the spring of 1745 when more British leaders and units start to come on to the board. And I mean, even really looking around right now, the French don't have any leaders, so I'm not sure, does anybody even want to do anything in the first year of campaigning? I don't know. They might not want to. There might not be sufficient reason to. So we'll look at that. So yeah, we'll see you guys in the spring of 17. I guess it would be the spring of 1745 when we'll come back. Okay, here we are at the spring of 1745, and well, I'll say that the first year was pretty quiet. It was mostly the recruiting of native allies, which there are a number on the board. Basically, if no territory changes, pretty much every Indian tribe unit is on the map that can be at this point. We'd need something to change, like the Iroquois loyalty level to change for the British to get it, or the French to make any major changes there. Because at this point, the Caughnawaga actually could come in, but we've not rolled successfully for it. But otherwise, everybody else is pretty stable. The Mohawk are in, and they're kind of holding a position along the Lake Champlain and Hudson River line. The French have some scattered. One here, the Ottawa have come down here to try to get to Crown Point to help defend that line. And then we had the Abenaki kind of swing around here, ready to pounce on any British that may be foolish enough to head into the wilderness. But I'm not sure that the British have much reason to at this point. And then, over here, this the Micmac have kind of come up into this position here, but they can't do much just because the Rangers are quite a potent force defending Annapolis. I've been wanting to get this guy into Louisburg, but I just can't seem to get him activated, which is a bit worrying. Reason why it's so worrying is now, as of this turn, we get a whole bunch more reinforcements, which many of them are provincial based. So we got this guy here in Maine, as well as the leader Pepperell, who is pretty good. 3 activations, so he's going to activate reasonably often. We also got a New Hampshire enlistment, and I've also called out the militia for Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and I think I also called out Massachusetts somewhere. Somewhere in the stack is the Massachusetts militia. At least I thought I had them out. Maybe I'm missing something. And maybe I've lost a counter somehow. What did I do with that guy? Oh, here we go. Well, I actually may leave this guy behind in Boston just to make sure nothing gets too crazy. But basically, Shirley now has a whole bunch of guys that showed up in Boston. So there's a whole bunch of these Massachusetts provincials. They're E enlisted, so that means they'll disappear in the winter, each winter. But they'll come back. So we kind of have a pretty nasty stack of guys that could prove very dangerous in civilized terrain, at least, or cultivated terrain. I mean, they've got some wilderness defense factors, so they could actually, this is actually a really potent force. And the French just don't have anything to stand up against it. We also got Rhode Island and Connecticut provincials. One thing to watch out for here is this Connecticut provincial has 4 steps. That number on the left indicates it has 4 steps. It has a second counter that is held off map until that unit takes 2 step losses. So it's actually a very hardy unit, interestingly enough. There are some other units that will eventually come into this scenario on the French side that are 4 step as well, that follow similar logic. My plan right now, I think, is to try to take... the other thing is the British Navy is in, including the Marines, that add another 6 combat factors, which is potent. I think I see no reason not to try, because the French just don't have as much on the board, to take Shirley and do a naval invasion of Louisburg. and try to get in and capture Louisbourg this campaign season. It will be very difficult for the French to get back into there for a while, and we can use that time to get some additional reinforcements and support and be positioned to be threatening Quebec pretty quickly. So I think Shirley's got the right set of units available to make the attempt on Louisbourg. I think we're going to try to do that because I got lucky and have the fleet this turn. Now's the time to try. Otherwise, what I may do is send the Rangers out to clear this native if the combat goes well. And then what I'd like to do is take Pepperell and swing him down, grab some of these guys, and start heading towards Crown Point. So it's not necessarily like the most efficient thing I could be doing with the leaders, but I want to get, because Shirley has such a potent force and we've got the fleet right now, might as well try for Louisbourg quickly. And then if Pepperell can activate enough, he can start making a threat. If he doesn't make it this year, that's okay. I think our main focus for the rest of this campaign season in 1745 is Louisbourg for sure, the most important element that we could hope to achieve at this point. So I'm going to go play it through, and then we'll come back in the spring of 1746. There'll be several other reinforcements coming on, including for the French, but I think the British feel pretty good about their odds. One other thing to watch out for is with this militia, if Pepperell can pick these guys up, several of these militia have those ambush factors, which is going to make it a lot easier for them to contest that Indian unit and make a push towards Montreal or some of the other fort areas along the way. So there's a lot of capability in the British force pool right now that really the French just can't match. They just don't have anything right now until the typhus army shows up. So generally speaking, I kind of feel like the French are just really outclassed in this scenario. Like it's just going to be on the odds that the British are probably going to win this one, but we've been surprised before, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, here we are at the spring of 1746. I'm going free cam for a second without the stand because I'm going to need to zoom around a little bit. So if you get motion sick easy, just brace yourself for impact. So a lot has gone on, and I'm going to need to kind of show the extent of it. So over here, and this is set up right before the operations phase of the spring turn. So you're going to notice this is pretty important. And I guess I need to do this, but we'll see what happens. I think he's gonna activate. So I will say this is the turn that we get our French reinforcements and pretty good leader along with disease. I don't know if this counts as biological warfare because, well, they didn't want to have typhus. But why are they coming onto the board? Well, Governor Shirley did take Louisbourg. He activated, and he got the best result that you could possibly get. They had 4-1 odds because of the Provincials plus the Marines from the fleet, and they took it with a die roll of 6, -2. That's -2 due to the fortification, plus the lack of artillery, while the French had artillery here. So it was because this unit here has artillery. None of the Provincials that went with Shirley had any artillery. But they managed to still roll well enough to cause 2-step losses, which was enough. They came in. But then what we also had happen is we had these special reinforcements replace 2 of the provincial units that were here. As part of when they withdrew, they get replaced with these units, is seemingly how that rule seems to work. You'll notice that they have artillery, so maybe you can assume they've captured the artillery guns of Louisbourg. And then we also got reinforcements. Now, I spread the reinforcements out a little bit, so we put one here just to kind of make sure we don't lose Louisbourg easily with Shirley. So that was the one special case. These Rangers did come out and eliminate the lone French regiment, which I couldn't get moving anywhere. And then up here, Pepperell, and I realized historically it was Pepperell that went to Louisburg, I think, and not Shirley, but I have to look at that. Pepperell had gathered up some units. He came up and he took Crown Point, but all the units he took with him, evaporate. So while it was a great campaign that was well executed and being able to move through this clear terrain uh, expedited his ability to get up there. He just couldn't push any further than having taken this hex up here before the winter, and the provincials had to go home. And now we see at spring we have some of our militia called out just to be on the board. They can't move by themselves, but they can be picked up, and they're pretty strong. So I'm going to do that when I can. But a lot of these provincials, the enlistments have sprung back up again. Um, Including several in Boston. I have chosen for now, for balance purposes, these were the two that we withdrew and replaced with the units with artillery. I'm going to keep them off the board because I guess you could interpret the rule as meaning these guys can come back in Boston like usual. But I feel like what that is supposed to represent are the units becoming re-equipped and sort of being pressed into longer term duty. And so to me, it doesn't make sense to have these guys just come back for free. So I'm going to leave them out. If for some reason it matters, maybe we'll put them back in. But I like the idea that that's a unit upgrade, not a freebie set of units that you're getting for that. But either way, I mean, we still get a bunch of these provincials. And I put some of our special regular reinforcements down here just so they're a little easier to co-locate with some guys. And plus we've got some blockade problems due to the French fleet being made available. And that happens before regular reinforcements. So it's sort of like pick your poison. Where do you want them to be? Um, Actually, and well, yeah, it's fine. I think we do that. Anyway, because you can't get reinforcements, I don't think, in a sea area that you have a enemy blockade. So I think I had to put them down here. Someone might need to correct me on that. Either way, a lot of these provincials are back, and then we also got some special Albany, or well, they're not special, they're just on the turn 13 reinforcements, a New York provincial, and then another British battalion here. Um, so when you look at the map situation, it's definitely tough for the French. They basically have two native allies on the board, which are going to be used to try to slow down any British advance up the Hudson River Valley and other advances towards Quebec. The French did get some reinforcements in Quebec itself, so they got a couple of infantry battalions and a leader. The leader activates on a 5 or less, so he's actually probably the most active leader we've seen in this game system so far across all the scenarios. But he is not going to have much to work with, right? He's got a few units. We got one replacement this spring, and I put it in Montreal, just figuring that may be first on the docket. But what I think we're going to do, assuming I can do this right, is I do want to get this French stack to try to attack Louisburg back and try to eliminate these units, or at least give them typhus, and get Louisburg back because, well, that's how they're going to hold on to the game at this point. The sad thing is, the British have control of, much of the map that matters right now, so it's going to be a fighting comeback. What the British will need to do is move some units up and occupy Crown Point and try to hold that hex permanently. Maybe easier said than done, but at the very least, they hold Annapolis. They're going to want to hold on to Louisburg, and that may simply be enough to win on those grounds. So we'll see what happens here. So we'll come back, and again, you can see I've got my militia stuff kind of off map. I'm a little disorganized, guys, but I'm not playing anyone but myself here, so I can do what I want. We'll come back in the spring of 1747 and see what's going on. The French are set to get some reinforcements then. Next turn, the British will get another unit And we may see, some contesting of the sea areas. So right now, the French fleet could not go to the Gulf of St. Lawrence because the British controlled Louisburg, but they can go to the Gulf of Maine. We could try to drop this stack on Boston. I don't think that would be a very good idea given the units that are there, but I think Louisburg's just more important. So we'll see what happens with that. I definitely feel like the French are disadvantaged here in this scenario, just because it feels like the British just have so many men, so many units that come back that it's really tough to see what's the best avenue for French victory, other than hoping that this expedition can tip the balance. Historically, they really didn't. They bled away and they didn't have a strong showing in the big scheme of things. If I roll well enough, getting lucky with the typhus, maybe they'll stick around long enough to hold things together. We'll see. Okay, still free camming it. Spring of 1747. Interesting things have occurred, and I can't help but laugh for some of it. So, indeed, over here, the French stack got initiative and attacked at Louisburg. They hurt the British, but then, and so the typhus marker is here. But the combat resulted in them having to retreat. Now, if I read the typhus rules correctly, um, both stacks now had typhus. So the French retreated over to here, um, and then the British also had typhus here. And over the course of a couple of turns, the French, having multiple steps, managed to survive while the British melted away. But unfortunately, both the French leader, Duc d'Anville, and uh, Governor Shirley died. There's a leader die roll, so they died of typhus in around Louisburg. And the funny thing is, if Louisburg is empty, it is French friendly. So it, like, the default control is to the French. And with some turn 19 reinforcements, we decided to put a guy right there in Louisburg, even though these guys are hanging out, because I need to figure out how to get them moved somehow. But just in case this guy wants to try to sneak across and get in behind the French, we put something in here so he at least has to fight for it. Probably wouldn't be very hard, but he has to fight for it, and he's at least in the fortification, because there's always a fortification in Louisburg. So that was kind of crazy. It was basically an attrition step loss every turn, even in the summer, that they had the typhus, and I would roll the die to see if it continued. Well, finally, after the British were gone and the French were on their last steps, did we roll a 5, which meant that the typhus was done. So that was pretty rough for everybody involved there. And then meanwhile, over here, we almost had Pepperell almost was at the gates of Montreal, but couldn't quite get there with enough activations. So despite all this power, we've got some British regulars up here who can't activate to save their life to build the fortification and the outpost. But they're trying. They need to get something going there because they're dangerously close to losing that space if they're not careful. Um, the militia at this point aren't being super helpful because they just can't get far enough to do anything. And the provincials are even really kind of tough to get going. So I'm trying to build up enough regulars over here that we can try to do another push sometime in this sort of last couple of campaign seasons. Because right now, if I look at the victory conditions, uh, let's see, who controls the majority? Okay, so British control Annapolis, French control Louisburg, but right now the British control uh, Crown Point, which is the remaining. So right now the British would win anyway. You'll also notice that we're missing our other French leader Ramsay and the units he had. Well, in a daring attack on some of these regulars that were holding Crown Point, they really flubbed the ambush roll that they had and did not didn't do anywhere near what they needed to do to to make progress. Um, and I'm just realizing I forgot to put a reinforcement on the board for the French. At least I think I forgot. Anyway, they tried and they flubbed it, and then in the linear combat they got eviscerated by the British regulars. So right now it would be a British victory, but the French still have some time left that they could try to do something. It's going to be all about, I think, now that Quebec seems relatively safe, um, because we control Louisbourg again as the French. The British could try to go for Louisbourg again, but I think the easier path may be, because they can't rely on the French or the British fleet showing up. It may simply be easier to fortify and defend Crown Point and have that sort of be the main angle of defense. So we'll see. We'll come back in the spring of 1748 and we'll see what's up. Really quick, I just want to, before I go any further, I just thought it was kind of interesting. A little narrative popped into my head where these provincials, these enlisted men, going off on a grand adventure to go take the fort of Louisbourg from the French. They get there, they succeed, spirits high. They get a little upgrade. They become these uh, upgrade, well, side grade units with artillery, and you can imagine, like, oh, they're writing letters to home. Hey, dearest whomever, or mom, we got artillery, we got cannon now. We're holding the fort of Louisbourg, and you're riding high, and the French show up. And you fend them off. You kick them back out. You continue to hold the fort, and then you get sick with typhus and die, and you fall apart. And meanwhile, all your buddies went back home to Boston. So you could just, I don't know, just kind of a sad narrative there that comes out of your war game with typhus. That despite that set of units performing well, admirably at that, um, the cruel twist of fate is against them. So I don't know. British will probably still win the conflict, but for those poor Massachusetts provincials, bit of a sad story. Okay, here we are at the spring of 1748. So the last three turns, right before the last three turns, I've already done fleet availability and native entry. So we have the French fleet here in the Gulf of Maine, though I don't think they're going to be doing a whole lot. And then there are a few allies on the board. These guys are still kind of poking around. The Rangers tried to get into Louisbourg and failed an ambush, and then got eliminated in linear combat against those weakened French troops. They're all hanging out in Louisbourg at this point. Now, otherwise, what we did have was Pepperell had come up Lake Champlain, and he had a nice big stack, and he marched his way up. He actually had cleared the Huron tribe units, which were around here, and couldn't quite have enough movement for the combat that he wanted. Actually, these guys should not even be here. They should be here. I'm not sure. I think I picked them up by accident. They should have. They would have wanted to attack Montreal, but they're just not going to be able to do it. And then when the enlistments went away, we're left with a couple of linear troops with no ambush factors, which kind of makes it dangerous. But I think, over the next couple of activations, the British aren't too worried. They keep failing to get this guy fortified in the fort, so they're going to try to do that at least. But they've got a few options, so it's shaping up like a British victory. We'll see here very soon. I'm going to play through the last three turns the spring and two summer turns of 1748, and we'll show the aftermath. But I'm going to bet it's going to be a British victory on controlling Annapolis, Crown Royal, versus French controlling Louisbourg. Okay, here we are at the end of King George's War, and this is a British victory, as I assumed it would be. There was an attempt via some lucky die rolls of the Provincials in Boston that had some fleet access for a while to try for Louisbourg again, just to see if we could get it, and they failed, unfortunately for them, so they went home. Either way, I think this is a decent victory for the British. They have basically Crown Point and some forward hexes completely covered. The French are kind of out of units. We did end up losing Pepperrell and those regulars nearby Montreal to some French units that ambushed them, but well, yeah, that was sort of unlucky die rolls for Pepperell to get reinforcements via reaction or to get away with reaction. So, um, generally, yeah, I kind of see it really hard for the French to win this scenario. We got lucky with Louisbourg, but I really feel like that shouldn't have even happened. Like we just barely got lucky with Louisbourg, getting it back and with the typhus and the whole thing. Um, so I feel like if you're going to play this scenario, it several of these scenarios I think work really well as solitaire exercises because it's just you rolling the die, right? Like you're like, I'm going to activate that guy, roll a die. Oh, you didn't get it. Next guy, roll the die. Didn't get it. You can get through a turn in like 5 minutes by yourself. But if you're playing against somebody and you're like hemming and hawing and you're like, okay, here we go. Oh, I got something, and then your next guy goes and I didn't get it. You could feel frustrated because it's more competitive because you're opposing someone, right? Where if I'm doing the solitaire, so I kind of just want to see how it plays out. So I'm not feeling that drag, but I can definitely see where it's like, man, if you're the French player, like, what do you even try to do? What can you do in this scenario? It feels like there's relatively limited options. You try to go for Annapolis, I guess, and then you hope to hold Crown Point, and you hope that you don't lose Louisbourg, and that's kind of it. Where you're very much on the defensive, you don't have as much capability to do things, um, and I guess that's the tricky bit. Okay, guys, well that's it for King George's War. The next one, if I'm not mistaken, should be the full French and Indian War, the one that most folks are familiar with, where the challenges of the French, I feel like, are going to be very similar, but they're going to have better leaders, and there will be more leaders, and there'll be more usage of the overall map. And it is one of the bigger scenarios that you'll see, uh, at least before we get into the American Revolution, which is gigantic by comparison. So there you go, guys. Hope this was entertaining to some degree. We'll see you in the next one. I think I'm going to do a little mini video for me, mini, meaning like 5 to 10 minutes long after this one very shortly. So you should see that soon. It's regarding supply, and I just want to make some commentary about the supply system and some things I may have gotten wrong in some previous videos, but were ultimately not super duper impactful. So thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Keep gaming. See you in the next one.